Hello, good evening. Welcome back to RTF Live Black or White because truth matters. ఈరోజు చాలా ప్రత్యేకమైనటువంటి అంశంతో మీ ముందుకు రావడం జరిగింది. మనము నివసిస్తున్న ఈ తరాన్ని పోస్ట్ ట్రూత్ జనరేషన్ అని అంటారు. ఇక్కడ ఆ, సత్యం అంత సీరియస్గా తీసుకోబడదు. కానీ మనకున్నటువంటి ప్రశ్నల్లో అత్యంత ప్రాముఖ్యమైనటువంటి ఒక ప్రశ్న ఆ, బైబిల్లో ఉన్నటువంటి దేవుని యొక్క క్యారెక్టర్ని గురించి అనేక సార్లు మనం అనేక రకాలుగా ప్రశ్నలు వింటా ఉన్నాం. ప్రత్యేకంగా ఈ మధ్యలో అనేక మంది పుస్తకాలు రాస్తా ఉన్నారు. వాటిల్లో ఒక ప్రశ్న ఏంటంటే, బైబిల్లో పాత నిబంధన దేవుడు క్రూరుడు, యుద్ధము యుద్ధకాంక్ష కలిగినటువంటి వాడు అని చాలామంది కామెంట్లు చేస్తూ ఉంటారు. అయితే ఈరోజు చాలా ప్రత్యేకమైనటువంటి డిస్కషన్ మనం కలిగి ఉండబోతా ఉన్నాం. I'm so glad to have my dear friend Timothy.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Brother John. It's my joy and privilege and honor to introduce my prof, Dr. James Allman, who is an Old Testament professor and also Bible exposition professor at Dallas Theological Seminary. He has been teaching there since 17 years, and he has recently written a book which has been released in 2017, which is called as "Accept One Another," which is an expositional commentary on the book of Romans. So, which has been one of the bestsellers on Amazon recently. So, congratulations to you, sir.
Thank you.
And yeah, so that our viewers would get a copy of it.
It's in the
yeah,
top 600.
yeah, it was on the top 600 from theological books section. So, and one important aspect that I want to let our viewers know is Dr. Alman is not a stranger to Indian people, especially to Telugu people. He has been visiting India since 1987 and has at least visited 19 times for various reasons, and especially to teach at several seminars. So we are glad to have somebody who has a great exposure to Indian audience and also who is very well versed with the subject that he is going to speak. So he has a huge reputation. So I had heard one story about Dr. Almond. That's from Dr. Eugene Merrill. So that's significant. So who is an Old Testament prof himself, emeritus Old Testament prof. So he would say, have you ever watched Jim opening his Bible? I said, yeah. He said, did you notice that he always carries an original language Bible? And that's where he meditates, that's from where he teaches, and he always lives with it, he said. So, yeah, it is our honor to have you on our show this evening, and I'm sure our viewers are there for a delight together. Over to you, Dr. Alvin.
Oh, thank you. In 1994, we were invited in India. We were invited to Tiruchirappalli to speak for the diocesan rededication for the bishop there. And when they introduced me as the Reverend Dr. Professor, and I thought, I need to move to India. They know how to treat a guy there. But now, you see, brother, I am no longer simply Reverend Dr. Professor. I'm Reverend Dr. Professor Professor. Because
two professors, yeah.
And as we say in the United States, with that and $5, you can get a cup of coffee at Starbucks. So So, so it's a minimal issue, but there it is. It's good to be with all of you. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to come back virtually to India and to speak, even so briefly. We've developed good friendships over the years and lasting relationships. So having this opportunity is another gift from God to me to be able to do this. And thank you, Brother Timothy, for allowing me this privilege. we're discussing a crucial issue. We go to the world, we bring the gospel of Jesus, we offer life and peace, and yet the Old Testament is full of war. And how can this God that Jesus represents, how can this God offer peace when he's carrying out war, and sometimes what we consider some of the worst kind of war, genocide? So what are we doing? And I have some notes that I've made available to Brother Timothy. You will have access to them if not already. But I want to start with some just general preliminary remarks. I'm a veteran of the United States Army. I spent 3 years in the early 70s in the military. Never went to war. It was during the Vietnam War, but I was not assigned to any unit that was sent to a war zone. But you know, if you're a soldier, that your life is expendable, and so you always have to keep in mind several things. And these preliminary thoughts, I think, are important for us. I have 6 of them. First, war is always a horrible thing. It puzzles me about Israel going to war. What did God do? What provisions did he make for the soldiers who came out of combat to overcome the horror of war? War is simply horrible. There's no way to make it anything but filthy and horrible. Second, war is virtually the natural condition of mankind. If you look through history, I looked and couldn't find, surely there's some place on the internet to do this, but I looked and tried to find if there are any substantial periods of peace in world history. Because of my background, I'm profoundly interested in ancient history, and one of the things that comes out of ancient history is the claim in the 1st century AD made by the Roman Empire that they had brought the peace of Rome to the Mediterranean. The peace of Rome included war, and it was about a century where there were no major wars. They were coming out under Augustus. They were coming out of a period of civil war, and there were no more civil wars, but there were still wars, military actions throughout that century. So what kind of thing is the Roman peace if there are still wars? So war seems to be virtually the natural condition of mankind. And I'd like to draw your attention to Romans 3, and verses 13 and 16. In Romans 3 and verse 13, we read, their throat is an open grave. He's describing in this passage, he's describing Israel, but he describes Israel, and that's clear from verses 19 and 20. He describes Israel in order to assert that the whole earth, the whole world, the whole human race is under condemnation. Why? Because even what we speak, often even when we speak it with good intent, we bring destruction. So verse 16, in their paths are ruin and misery, and the way of peace they have not known. This is the human lot. This is our condition. So that we would have war in the Old Testament is not a shocking thing. It is what is shocking is periods of peace. We're not prepared for thinking about periods of peace. I have grown up here in the United States. I don't know whether you can tell that by looking at me, but I grew up in the United States, and in the in my lifetime, we have had the Korean conflict, and we've had the Vietnam War, and we've had the two Gulf Wars, and so forth. Other actions that we've had, but in America, in my whole lifetime, there's never been war. We have grown to think that the norm for life is peace and comfort, but that's an anomaly in world history. War is the normal state of things. Um, the strong prey on the weak, the evil prey on the good, and I'm using evil and good here in a limited human way. If the weak or the good do not wish to be destroyed, they must prepare for war. So, so everybody is always anybody in government is always thinking, what if we get attacked? What are we going to do? How would we respond? And so that is a necessary part of human life. Third preliminary observation, thus some wars are necessary. Not all wars are, but some are. And I would argue that World War II was a necessary war. If Hitler, if the fascists in Italy, if the totalitarians in Japan had their way, all of us would have been enslaved in their systems, and there would have been no peace, there would have been no freedom. So that war was necessary. It was necessary in ways we didn't know when we got into it, namely the Holocaust and the attempt to exterminate the Jews. So some wars are necessary. Fourth observation, all war occurs because of human sin. Mm. There's simply no way to avoid that. Greed, hatred, lust for power, fear. Some warlike peoples become warlike because of past abuse by others. One of the reasons that Russia has the foreign policy it has, they want the largest possible land mass that they can get to keep enemies at a distance because they've been abused by other nations in the past. So all war comes because of human sin. Fifth, sin is not God's fault. Mm-hmm. It's essential that we understand that. God knows how to use sin. He allows it temporarily for his own purposes. He also curbs it, restricting some of the damage sin might cause, but he doesn't restrict all of the damage of sin. That's evident in individual human lives. It's evident in nations. It's evident in the world. The effect of human sin is damaging. It's always damaging, and God uses that for a variety of his purposes. And sixth, genocide is a key problem in thinking about war. We rightly abhor genocides we have seen, that is, in our recent 20th and 21st century periods. How can you justify what happens in Central Africa? How do you justify what was going on in Uganda? How can you justify what happened in Thailand and in not Thailand, but in Burma and other countries of Southeast Asia? How can you justify that? How can you, and of course, from my point of view, culturally, the World War II and the genocide of the Jews, how can you justify that? You can't. It is something to abhor. It's something to denounce. But this is part of the sin that God allows. Sin, and I won't point this out later, but sin is inherently a choice for death. Every sin that I commit is a choice for death. I don't see it because God has withheld the long-term not benefits, the long-term effects of sin from us, and that lulls us to sleep. But all sin is a choice for death. The first sin was a choice for death, because to cut oneself off from the God of life is to cut oneself off from life. But also, we must be careful on this, not allowing our human sensibilities to determine our understanding of who God is. I have notions about reality that are completely mine. They are not from Revelation. And because I have these notions about reality, I assume that therefore my notions about reality are the right ones always, and everybody should accept my definitions. The problem is I'm not in a position to actually define things. I have to have somebody else define them for me. So that's part of what we're going to do today in the rest of our time. The first major point I want to make is, and there are only two. First, we're going to discuss God in war. Why is God involved in war on any basis? And first, at capital A, God guided even wicked Israelite kings in warfare. 2 Kings 14, 25 and 27 is one of the more amazing passages, frankly, in the Old Testament, where Jeroboam II, there are two Jeroboams in the Old Testament. The first one was the first king of the northern kingdom. The second one was the last great or powerful king in the history of the northern kingdom. He was a wicked man, a horrible man. But God sent the prophet Jonah, verses 20, now I've lost my place, 25 and 27, tell us, he sent the prophet Jonah to give him instructions on how to win wars. So I can't escape this. God is even involved in wicked Israel's sin and warfare. Second, kingship came to Israel specifically as a means of prosecuting war. So in 1 Samuel chapter 8, one of the reasons that Israel asked for a king is that they wanted somebody to fight their wars for them. The Lord was not a reliable war leader, because if he loses the war, he loses nothing. If a human king loses the war, he loses everything. So they wanted a human king that they could rely on, somebody that would always work for victory. God would turn Israel over to the effect of their own sin by defeat in battle. So God was not a reliable war leader. Therefore, they wanted somebody who was reliable. So the proof of Saul's fitness for kingship came in war. In 1 Samuel 10:27, when Saul was identified as king, there were worthless men, the text tells us, worthless men who said, will this man rule over us? And it is not until chapter 11, and especially chapter 11, that it turns out, yes, this is the man that will rule over us. He goes to battle to protect the city of Jabesh Gilead from Ammonite invasion, and he brings home the victory. And then people say, where are those who said, will this man rule over us? Bring them here, let them be put to death. And Saul, in a very good indication about his character, we get a lot of bad press about Saul. Let's say some nice things about him. King Saul said, no, the Lord has brought victory today. There will be no deaths today. But there's also a passage in chapter 14, verses 47 and 48. Since it's only two verses, we tend to run by them in our reading, and we don't pay much attention to them. But they are an account of how God gave victory to Saul over every enemy all the way around Israel. So God was involved in warfare. Some of it wicked, some of it godly, a God-designed war to protect and establish Israel as a people. Third, war was God's designed means for establishing his kingdom through Israel, his means for bringing peace and justice to the nations. In fact, Israel's mission is to establish a kingdom for God on the earth and extend it by diplomacy if possible, by war if necessary. So Deuteronomy 20 is not in the notes, but Deuteronomy 20 gives Israel's Great Commission. Their mission to the nations is not to preach the gospel of peace. Their mission to the nations is to proclaim the establishment of the kingdom of God. And having established the kingdom of God, then the nations were offered a place in it. If they would accept it, then they became subjects of the kingdom. If they rejected it, then Israel was to make war with them. But that was the way to bring justice and peace to the nations. Fourth general observation about war. War remains God's means of establishing his rule over the earth. Even today, God has not forsworn war. There is coming a time, if we read the New Testament well, there is coming a time when Jesus will lead war. So Revelation 18 to 20, there is first the destruction of Babylon. Then in chapter 19, you have the coming of the one who is dressed in white, and he's on a white horse, and on his thigh is written a name which no one knows but he. His name is the Word of God. And he has a sword going out of his mouth, and with it he makes war on the nations. The imagery there is not intended to be visual, it's intended to be conceptual. The idea is he will kill the enemy nations by the word of his mouth, by the simple statement of his word. He will bring about the victory in the battle. He's accompanied by an innumerable company. But they don't fight. They are simply the honor guard for the one warrior. And Jesus ultimately is the only warrior in all of war that's ahead for us and in our past, in fact. Fifth, our present role in God's plan is different, though. Warfare is not our precise method for work. We bring the gospel of peace, Ephesians 6:15. It's a gospel of Jesus, the gospel of God. It is the gospel of the kingdom. It is the message of resurrection. It is the message of grace. This is our means of bringing the nations to the Lord. This is a day unlike the days of Israel. Israel's history starts with Abraham in about 2000 BC and ends as a nation in 586 BC. And their whole ministry was war, not proclamation. With Jesus comes a whole ministry of proclamation, not war. The church has misunderstood this to the extent that we have identified ourselves as the continuation of Israel on the earth. Thus, the Crusades were a necessary task. If the church is Israel, then the work is to go make war, as Israel did, go make war and bring nations under the sway of King Jesus. But our mission is different. It's a mission of gospel proclamation. Second, it's a message of God's power, Romans 1:16. Three indications of that power in the book of Romans. One, it breaks the cycle of sin. Romans 1, wherefore God handed them over. 3 times he says this. God handed them over. 2 more sin. But now in Romans 6, 7, and 8, we discover that God has broken that cycle of sin. It does not have to happen anymore. And a little shameless self-promotion here. The book Accept One Another will explain what I'm talking about there. Second, it restores us to the glory of God. Romans 3, we have fallen short of the glory of God. But Romans 5, we boast in hope of the glory of God. And then third, it transforms covenant curse into covenant blessing. That's a peculiarly important insight in Romans 8. You have the, what shall separate us from the love of God? Shall tribulation or distress? And you know that list. Those are all covenant curses under the Mosaic covenant. But God has transformed them, Romans 8. See, I have a doctorate from Dallas Seminary. I know great and wise things most people don't know. And Romans 8:35 follows Romans 8:28. I don't know whether you even are prepared to understand the significance of that, but I'm here to show you because I have this doctorate from Dallas Seminary. But in Romans 8:28, all things work together for good. Those all things are sufferings. That passage begins in verse 18 and goes to verse 39. And verse 35, the sufferings of what were covenant curse now produce the likeness of Christ in us. They're not evidence of being separated from the love of God as they were in Leviticus 26. They're evidence that God is molding us into the likeness of Christ. So the message of God's power, the gospel, is what sets us free. It doesn't enslave, it doesn't destroy, it builds up. Third, it aims to turn Gentiles to worship. It turns Gentiles into worship offerings